Hello, BookTube. I had a fantastic weekend of reading. Did you? Utterly fantastic. You can't always predict that. I read a lot, and I read all weekend long, and my habit, most of the time, during the week, for instance, a holdover from working and having weekends off, my habit during the week, as you know, is to read on and off throughout the day while I write and do other things, play with the puppy and walk the puppy and whatnot. And then at midnight, every night, shut off everything and just read for hours at a stretch. But on the weekend, I tend to read more. I tend to abandon that habit and just indulge myself in reading more. And I did that this weekend, read a lot, and I mean, you can't always predict. The books have to line up right, and in this particular weekend, the books did. Not all of them, of course. Not all of them. There was a self-published book by an African divine, by an African preacher man, all about his contention that rainbows are angels. Goes into quite specific detail about how rainbows are angels. Mainly on the basis of two contentions of his. One, that science doesn't understand what they are, so they must be supernatural. And two, that if they're supernatural, they must be angels. And in my review, I politely pointed out that number two is wrong because angels in the Judeo-Christian tradition are one of roughly 8.5 million supernatural beings thought up by human beings in the last 18,000 years. So deciding that something is supernatural does not automatically move you to one tiny little creation of one tiny little culture in one tiny little region at one tiny little time. And two, rainbows are not inexplicable, scientifically speaking. In my review, I suggested that the author sit in on an 8th grade science class when rainbows come up, and he will hear a perfectly good explanation of why they happen. That wasn't good. And I also read a mainstream novel. I won't name any names, because of course you don't need a warning, right? The viewers on this channel don't sully their hands with the made-up stories. But I read a mainstream novel. It's my fate, alas, to read everything. And it was god-awful. It wasn't technically inept, like the book I just mentioned, but it was so willfully blind on the part of the author, who had no idea. The reader is given in the course of this novel absolutely no incentive to keep reading. If you weren't a professional critic, I don't know why you would read past page 20. And I'm confident that not many people will. But in the main, my reading this weekend was wonderful, and I wanted to talk to you a little about it because it's going to consist of a series of recommendations, and I love recommending books to readers. So first, two books that I want to show you are books that you saw in my Friday reads, and I went on to read them, and now I want to talk about them just a bit, just a little. My full reviews of these things will appear elsewhere. But the first one is by Tariq Baghoni, and it is Hamas Contained. It's a very sedate title, and it's a very subdued cover. For some really good, strong thinking. I could almost have gone with a better packaging for this book. Probably the author himself was against that because he's a serious thinker. Despite his extreme youth, I think we covered that in the last time I brought this book up, he's extremely young. There is an enormous brain in that head, young as it is. And he has a serious book to write here about Hamas, which is a fraught subject. And the author is correct that in a lot of news venues and commentary venues in the West, you can't talk about Hamas unless you agree with the basic assumption of the dialogue, which is that it's thoroughly evil. Which really stilts conversation. And once I read that contention on the author's part, I thought, well, is that true? And then I thought back on a lot of the times I've seen it come up. And the conversation certainly does seem freighted towards foregone conclusions. The author also makes a wonderful, wonderful point that I hadn't really thought about before, which is that the world, the Western world, now completely frowns on colonialism. You only have to bring it up for people to go on ad nauseum about the evils of colonialism. British colonialism, Russian colonialism, French colonialism. And the author is completely right in saying that right in the middle of all of those conversations, right in the middle of the present day, is an exactingly horrifying exercise in colonialism that's taking place right under everybody's nose. what the viewing the Palestinian territories, viewing the Gaza Strip as a colonial possession of Israel. The book pulls no punches. The author sets a very scholarly, intellectual tone. He clearly wants to examine things rather than, throw invective around. But he pulls no punches in seeing Israel as being largely at fault in this situation. And a couple of his conclusions about how flexible Hamas has been over the years, I could easily see critics of this book taking contention with those. And I took a little contention with them myself. I'm no expert on the subject, but I have read many, many books on the subject. I find it absolutely fascinating that this superating abscess exists in the modern world with America's foremost ally in the Middle East. My conclusion is that you have to read this book if you're interested in the subject. There are many, 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 many books in every season, but you have to read this one. Not just because of the author's really deep and sober thinking, but also because when he takes a breath, so to speak, and looks away from the stark realities of his subject, the horrible lives of people living in the Gaza Strip, when he looks away from that, when he raises his eyes just a bit, his talent for dramatic scene setting really rushes in. There are scenes in this book that are incredibly memorable that don't have anything to do with the main polemic of his argument. So, if you're interested in the Israel-Palestine conflict, if you're keeping up with it, if you have an opinion on either side, you should read this. I don't know if you have access to an academic library, they will certainly have it. I don't know if your mainstream library will. I don't even want to know. I don't think I have a pub sheet for this, but it's probably enormously expensive to just go to a store and buy. But if you're interested in the subject, if you have a library on the subject, this has to be in it. So that's book number one. Definitely a recommendation. Incredibly somber reading. Book number two is also a recommendation, a little more qualified. This is 3 Days in Moscow by Bret Baier, who is a news commentator for Fox News, and writing about Ronald Reagan as Ronald Reagan admonishes the Soviet Empire on Soviet soil. And if you take all that together, you would be completely forgiven for thinking, oh, okay, I know what this is going to be. It's going to be a party tract. It's going to be that odious phrase that has now entered common parlance because of the current U.S. president. You might think that this is red meat for the base. But it's not. It's not entirely. Bret Baier and his co-writer, Catherine Whitney, are too smart for that. There is a balance here. There is analysis here. It's the man at the center, Ronald Reagan. The portrait of him throughout this book is lightly, affectionately, but very definitely hagiographic. He can do no wrong. He has no flaws. And he has a vision of the future that is like that of an Old Testament prophet. He has a vision of the future that his disciples, his adherents, and his enemies don't share, but he's right and they're wrong, and there are strains of music in the background. When a situational awareness of what Reagan was like at the time, a dollop of that kind of, take a step back and take a realistic look at what was going on here might have strengthened this book. In fact, it would have gone a long way, because there's a pious tone throughout here, a pious tone that Reagan invokes in even sober historians. So I went in expecting it, and I got it. But unlike with a great many books that indulge in that pious tone when it comes to Ronald Reagan, it doesn't invalidate the worth of this book, because the main strength of this book is its narrative. The authors know how to tell a story, a really good story. They make the story of Reagan's trip to Moscow University and the speech that he gave, they situate those minutes inside a much larger picture, and they do a really good job of it, and not an inaccurate job. That's what saves the book, is that the hagiography and the slightly honeyed lens that they turn on Ronald Reagan himself, they don't use on anything else in the book. Not on Russian politics, not on American geopolitics, not on the incidents or events of the time, not on any other personalities, just him. So, if you go into the book with a grain of salt, if you go into the book expecting that they are going to let their guy off light, you're going to get a lot of great stuff everywhere else. And that's why I recommend this book. Not unqualifiedly. It's not an unqualified recommendation. This is definitely partisan, but gently so, forgivably so. So now that you know that, you can read it for all that it's worth. I might stress here that now that you know that it's slightly, ever so slightly, tilted in favor of Ronald Reagan and kind of nostalgic view of the Republican conservatism of Ronald Reagan, now that you know that, if you know that that is also your own tendency, reading this one might be a really good exercise in testing those assumptions on your own part. So this is worthwhile. It will certainly be in your library. It will certainly be in your bookstore. It will have its day in the sun. So, I mean, there's money behind this that isn't necessarily behind Hamas Contained. So if the subject interests you, this is not dumb. This is not Bill O'Reilly. This is actually worth reading. So that's a second recommendation. And then third book, tiny little thing. Take you an hour to read. And you are deeply invested in the subject. All of you are. And that made it fascinating for me to realize that this is actually a lingua franca. This is actually something we're all invested in. And it's hard to find subjects like that, right? I mean, I know somebody who is a game warden in Wyoming, who I don't think, if you were to wake him up early in the morning, I don't think he could even tell you who's president. He certainly doesn't pay any attention to any political problems or issues in the country or the world. If you were to ask him to name a national sports team, any sport, any city, he couldn't do it. So there are all sorts of subjects that aren't universal, but this subject is universal. And that subject, of course, is what we're doing right now, the internet, social media. And the book is this. 10 Arguments for Deleting Your Social Media Accounts Right Now by Jaron Lanier, who wrote You Are Not a Gadget. He's one of the he's often, with a touch of hyperbole, he's often described as one of the architects of the internet. And you look at, he's certainly one of the original robber barons of the internet. An architect too, I might say. One way or another, this is a tiny little thing, but one way or another, I will say that he's one of the most thought-provoking thinkers about the internet and writers about the internet. It takes, believe it or not, it takes an extreme amount of not only eloquence but confidence to write a book with this title that's this long. That's not a cop-out. That's actually no mean feat to do that. I want to read you the 10 arguments, the names of them, because the pub sheet and the book itself list them all over. He obviously doesn't care that you know them ahead of time. He wants you to read his descriptions of them. And they are this. Argument 1 is you are losing your free will. Argument 2 is quitting social media is the most finely targeted way to resist the insanity of our times. Argument 3 is social media is making you into an asshole. Argument 4 is social media is undermining the truth. Argument 5 is social media is making what you say meaningless. Argument 6 is social media is destroying your capacity for empathy. Argument 7 is, and this is one of the best chapters in the book, one of the 2 best chapters in the book, social media is making you unhappy. Argument 8 is social media doesn't want you to have economic dignity. Argument 9 is also another highlight of the book. Social media is making politics impossible. And argument 10 is social media hates your soul. And it's terrific. This is just a terrific, terrific book. Out of the 10 arguments, I thought immediately and held throughout the book counter-arguments to 8 of the 10. There are strong and rather, I think, obvious counter-arguments to 8 of the 10. But that doesn't lessen the arguments at all. This is still the most thought-provoking book you will read about social media in this year. And so I highly, highly recommend it. I don't know. This is $18 for the hardcover. So, you know, your Barnes & Noble probably have it 20% off. You probably have coupons or something like that. So this you might actually go out and buy. And in this isolated case, a very rare instance, I would actually advocate that, because this is something everybody needs to think about, especially as the 21st century advances, because, you know, he's not the first writer to say. There are many other writers who've said, who've repeated the old adage of advertising, which is that if you can't spot the product, you are the product. The internet age is making a oil-like commodity. See, I'm allergic to Adam at Memento Mori, and now that he's back on BookTube, I sneeze in every video. But anyway, as I was opining, the internet age is making an oil-like commodity out of your digital presence, out of your attention. Not your money and not your clicks, but your attention. As Jaron Lanier points out in this book at one point, in the past, newspapers put horoscopes in the newspaper, and you looked up your horoscope and you read it, but no one knew you were doing that. No one knew that you were responding to that horoscope in any way. They didn't know how many people were reading it. A newspaper might, in a general sense, know whether or not the readers want a horoscope feature. But they wouldn't get a campaign of letters from Aries. They would get a campaign of letters, 1 or 2, 4 or 5 letters from readers saying, we'd like a horoscope feature. But the creators of that horoscope feature and the publishers of the newspaper had no idea what you were actually doing. And that's not true anymore. Everything you do now online is not only interactive, but monitored and monetized. And people aren't taking advantage of that when they should. That's a natural resource. It is, by many accounts, including convincingly in this book, the main currency of the world today that you are generating without any compensation at all. So, I think we can all agree, I don't know, there'll be holdouts, TED Talk people, but I think we can all agree you're not going to delete all of your social media accounts right now and never have a social media presence again. Jaron Lanier has no social media at all, that he claims. There are probably people like him that don't. He certainly has disdain for people who do in this book, but you're obviously not going to do that. And you're not going to refrain from deleting your social media accounts because you're some sort of mindless lemming. You're going to refrain from doing it because you need a moment's thought to say, okay, objectively speaking, there's this, and this good that these social media accounts give me. What this book does better than any book I've read on the subject, even books 5 times as long, is shine a light on the differences between the things that are good and the things that are bad, mainly by saying there are no good things. So it will give you so much to think about. So this is an unqualified recommendation, and on this channel, an unqualified recommendation is a recommendation in which I am advocating that you go out and buy the book if you're interested in the subject. And our last book is the same kind, but oh my God, the tiny amount of bank credit that I have with you all, I am about to exhaust completely. The last book I want to recommend here is the highest recommendation for any book that I've read so far in 2018. I cannot readily imagine a book in 2018 surpassing it. My opinion, this is my second read-through. My opinion going in the first time was mighty high. My opinion going out of it the second time, I'm just staggered. And that hasn't happened to me yet this year. You can see it coming. That is this. The Carbon Ideologies by William Vollmann. 2 800-page volumes. I call it one book. I'm going to refer to it as one book because it clearly is one book. And it is staggering. Just staggering. It isn't just Vollmann thinking about mankind's dependence on carbon fuels and the ruinous nature of that and the cost of that in the present day and the history of that a little and also the future of that. It isn't just that. It's a complete, detailed sonogram of that world. He doesn't just sit in his study and write about it and do some research. He goes out and talks to everybody. Everybody. Organic farmers in Oregon. Crew bosses on offshore oil rigs. Oil executives. Gas executives. Fracking engineers. Fracking frauds. Everybody. I don't know how he got these people to talk to him, much less to talk to him the way they do. Without exception. These books are entirely full of long interviews with people who are involved in the carbon industry. And without exception, the interviews read as if the person who was talking to Volman had no idea that there was such a thing as civil litigation. That part was absolutely astonishing. I read interviews with Volman about these books, which one interviewer incredulously said, well, it's 2 on 800-page volumes. Did you think about maybe cutting some of these interviews, some of this background material, some of these interactions that you have with people, and concentrate more on the theoretical stuff? And he seemed genuinely confused by that question, and said that he couldn't think of anything to cut. And I scoffed at that before I read these books. And I scoffed at it even a little after I read them through the first time. Now, I agree with him completely. I wouldn't cut a word. This is the best thing he's ever written. And this is an author who's written a lot. Everything he's written in the past, especially things that are enormous, have had longueurs. They've had dead spaces. Even he did a book called The Dying Grass a few years ago, a gigantic historical novel that I thought was brilliant. But even there were 10, 20, even 30-page stretches where he had lost his way and was waiting to get the bounce back in the narrative. Unbelievably, in these volumes, the narrative never lapses for even a minute. And in addition to that, you might remember on my Friday reads, I said that one of the ways that I was going to go at these things to decrease my own trepidation about what an investment of time and energy this is, would be to think of it in historical context, like I did with Yuri Slezkin's book, The House of Government, which was about one apartment building in Soviet Russia. I went into that intimidated, but thinking a way to take the top spin off this is to remember that this is a finite footnote. This is not an ongoing story. This is a finite footnote in history. It had a beginning, a middle, and an end. And for some reason, that gives you a little footstep of superiority over the subject and allows you to go at it without feeling like you need to be in remedial school. And I thought the same thing going in. I said on Friday Reads, I thought the same thing going into this, that no matter how intimidating the subject is, no matter how thorough or comprehensive Volman does at it, I can have a slight leg up on it by remembering that this story has an ending. It hasn't been written yet, but it is absolutely inevitable. Carbon fuels are not like wind or solar or tide or geothermal. They have a limit. A very small prescribed limit. They will be gone in 100 years. No matter what humanity does, no matter what ways humanity finds to dig them or blow them up or drag them out of earthquake fault lines or whatever, in 100 years we won't be talking about this because they won't be there. It's the same thing as whale oil. And I was amazed to find out, rereading this and sifting through all of the points where Volman drops out of interviews and drops out of fact and just opinionizes, that he thinks the same thing. These books are couched in the diction of an America that no longer exists. He's writing as if these were historical accounts of our present day. And my end verdict is that this is an overwhelming recommendation. Overwhelming. These things are not cheap. This is, each book is $40. That's $100 for the 2 volumes of the one book, The Carbon Ideologies. And yet, if you can spare it, I say spend it. And that's hard for me to do because this is an enormous investment of time and energy, even for me and for a reader who has friends, social life, a family, a job. I can't even think. It would take probably months to read something like this. So I don't make this recommendation lightly, but nevertheless, I do make it. This is almost certainly be the most important book of any kind on any subject to come out in 2018 in English, and is certainly one of the most important books that's ever been written in American nonfiction. It's just, I feel a little rotten pushing it because it's a huge burden on a reader. So my strong advice would be go to your library and get them to order these volumes. I don't know that they'll make the outlay on their own. They might not. I've been hearing stories from some of you about local libraries that sound like pleasure palaces. Just amazingly encouraging stories from a lot of you about how great your libraries are. If that's the case, then get yourself on the waiting list for these books and just start the first volume. I am confident the few of you who listened to my raves about Yuri Slezkin's The House of Government, despite how big it was, universally, I don't think anyone has come back to me otherwise, have universally reported that it was very much as advertised. It was worth their time. I stake a lot on my reputation as someone who doesn't make these recommendations lightly, and I'm making it again in this case, even though the book is twice as big as The House of Government. I'm making it again that this is not a book you should miss if you're in the least ways interested in the subject. And like the Jaron Lanier book, you kind of should be. It affects everybody. It's the world. It's the entire world that we live in is based on this kind of energy that is ruinously extracted, ruinously refined, and ruinously short, ruinously futile. So one way or another, that's going to end my Monday reads for today. I'm sorry. In a way, I do sincerely apologize for that last recommendation, but you shouldn't miss this book. So that's what we have. We have the Carbon Ideologies. And on the exact opposite end of the length spectrum, we have, what was it again? 10 arguments for deleting your social media accounts right now. Bit of a mouthful of a title, but incredibly interesting as a book. Then 3 Days in Moscow, about Ronald Reagan. And then Hamas Contained, which is the most specialized of all the books. Everybody's heard tall stories about Ronald Reagan, and everybody uses carbon energy, and everybody uses social media. Hamas Contained is the most specialized of the group, but I do recommend them all. And that's wonderful. It's a wonderful feeling for me to get to the end of a reading weekend with so many high points. And also with something like the Carbon Ideologies, which blew me away, which doesn't happen often. Certainly doesn't happen often enough. So that's that. I'm going to wrap this up for now. That is my Monday Reads report for you. And I'll be back. Thank you, BookTube.